everybody, welcome to this, the second of the online British Animal Studies Network meetings on the subject of care. This time we are looking at care and wild animals, and we've got three papers. We're organising it slightly differently today, and that will be the reason for that will become clear as we go through. So we're going to hear two papers, Monica's and Emilie's papers, and then have Q&As on the two of them, and then we'll get to the second part of the session. So at this point, I am going to introduce our first speaker. I'm turning to my screen over here to read her biography. So Monica Vasile is a PhD candidate in environmental history at Maastricht University, and she's part of the research group Moving Animals, A History of Science, Media and Policy in the 20th Century since March 2020. Her research focuses on the history of species conservation and averting extinctions, and her approach integrates animal history with a history of science and conservation. Monica obtained a PhD in sociology from the University of Bucharest in 2008, with a dissertation on forest commons in the Romanian Carpathian Mountains, and has also been a fellow at the LMU Rachel Carson Centre and a researcher at the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology in Halle. And as this says, her paper today is called Unlikely Technologies of Care, Dart Guns, Hand Puppets, and Locked Feeding Stations to the Rescue of Nearly Extinct Species. Emilie, thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. Can you see my PowerPoint all right? Is that, yeah?
That's great, yeah.
Okay. So I will talk today about a topic that I sort of encountered in my research, but I haven't really researched that thoroughly before, which is technologies of care in conservation practices. Since the dawn of the 20th century, species conservation practices have become increasingly interventionist, labor-intensive and costly. Caring for critically endangered wildlife and the attempts to save species from extinction required pioneering and messy work. And in these practices, technologies have been ubiquitous. And while technologies for monitoring and wildlife tracking like satellite telemetry or camera traps have perhaps received quite a bit of attention from historians and geographers recently, for example, these papers by Erika von Essen and colleagues, also by my colleague Simone Schlepper, also earlier from Hugo Reinhardt. In this presentation, I focus on a few technologies which have received perhaps less attention and which I encountered in my research on the history of reintroducing endangered species. So I will talk about hand puppets for raising chicks, dart guns used for immobilization and administration of drugs, and feeding hoppers for kakapos. And I will show that in the short run, these technologies might be risky, traumatic, deceiving, infuriating for the animals, and they can actually also cause the death of animals in some cases. However, in the long run, humans are seeking the well-being of the animals, and these technologies are part of the solution to, so to say, to save animals. What is interesting for me is that these technologies are usually meant to erase the human, to remove the human from the interaction as much as possible. So to replace human handling with something that is thought to be more neutral, like technologies. And these technologies, in the words of Hugo Reinhardt, realize at the same time control and withdrawal, absence and intimacy. One technology of care widely used in conservation of birds is decoys. Decoys are life-size models of a creature or part of a creature meant to induce animals to believe and act in certain ways. Decoys are deceptions. They have been used for centuries in game hunting, especially wildfowl decoys. More recently, they have been repurposed from devices meant to kill animals to devices meant to save animals. Decoys and hand puppets have been used, especially in bird conservation, for feeding hen-reared chicks. I'm not sure why this cling is going, but maybe it's not so disturbing.
It's because people are entering the room still.
Okay.
Ignore it.
So one example that I want to give is the California condor. So the California condor is a notorious case in conservation. And a captive breeding program began in 1980 when an estimate of only 22 California condors were left in the world. And conservationists needed to come up with ideas to make more condors. But the birds typically laid only one egg at a time. So boosting the numbers would have been really, really slow. So to make it somewhat faster, they were trying to induce the birds to double clutch. They removed one egg and fostered it, allowing the parents to lay another egg. So that meant sort of double production. Since the 1940s, with the studies of Konrad Lorenz, it was known that hand-reared birds imprint on humans. So it was believed that human care hinders the abilities of the chicks to identify with their own species and especially to mate with their own kind. So to avoid imprinting and socially impairing the birds, condor hand puppets were used to raise the chicks. Puppets like those here that I show in this slide, in the shape of adult condors, fed the hatchlings until they fledged. But while double clutching worked well and the chicks survived, the long-term effects of such technologies remained unknown. And how successful would puppet-reared chicks be in the wild when released? Was there any difference between them and the parent-reared chicks? And there was a lot of science and research surrounding these questions. So this care for the species and care for the behavioral integrity of the chicks, was it really working? Research seemed to show that puppet parent raised trouble condors. In 1992, when puppet-reared condors were first released, many died, and nearly 20% had to be recaptured for behavioral problems. They were seeking of humans. By contrast, later in 1996, when parent-raised condors started to be released, these ones fared really better comparatively. This meant that puppet-reared condors had a behavioral problem, and they had less of a chance to survive as wild condors. So scientists and conservationists had figured out that initially puppeteers were perhaps too gentle with the chicks. And for example, researcher Amy showed that these birds, the birds that were raised with puppets, did not integrate well into the condor community, and they showed what she called an unhealthy curiosity about humans. Then the puppeteers became more aggressive in their feeding behavior, and the chicks were also placed into what was called a mentoring program with adult condors in an aviary before being released. So nobody deluded themselves that this was even coming close to the real thing. However, the increase in condor numbers was promising, and captive breeding went on. And puppets have been widely used in captive breeding of rehabilitation of birds, so with other species as well. So this technology of care might solve some problems, but careful research is needed to understand the limits, the dangers, and the compromises of care practices, and look into the effects of such technologies of care. Next, I would like to talk a bit about dart guns, which I encountered in the case of the Przewalski horse. So for wildlife in captive breeding facilities, such as large mammals, like dangerous big cats, for example, or horses or antelopes, one of the problems faced by keepers and conservationists was how to capture and handle these animals, how to treat injuries, for example, or how to administrate drugs that were meant to treat parasites or other ailments, how to manage to insert microchips or transmitters. These were seen as essential in caring for the animals. But how to achieve this without chasing the animals to exhaustion, without habituating them too much, or without stressing them? one of the solutions found was this dart gun, or the tranquilizer gun, which operates like a flying syringe that delivers a drug to the animal. It's actually very complicated to do this right. And the person has to aim very precisely at the part of the body of the animal that is muscled, like for example, with a horse, and they have to make sure that the horse will fall in a certain way that to avoid injury. And also the dose of the drug has to be right. All in all, being tranquilized is quite a stressful and risky operation for the animal. But in the long run, this sort of capture and treatment is seen as beneficial for the animals. This is why darting, I can call it a technology of care. It is a technology of care also understood in the larger picture of recovering an endangered species, which require, for example, translocations or reintroduction or treatment against foreign parasites. And this dart gun technology comes close to the ideas expressed by Tom Van Doren and Juno Salazar Pareñas, who have explored this idea that care for wildlife in captive breeding environments can be violent. And the idea that, in the words of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, care is grounded in the inescapable troubles of interdependent existences and can offer no guarantee of a smooth, harmonious world. Another technology of care I want to talk about is this sort of supplementary feeding station used in the conservation of kakapo. The station is made in such a way that it only opens for a certain bird, and it weighs the bird as it is feeding. The bird is equipped with an individual transmitter which signals whether it is the right bird for the feeder to open. In this case that you see here, it's not the right bird. And while it hops onto the scales, the feeder opens or it doesn't open, as it is the case here. So these hoppers have mechanical arms plugged into a data logger that is fed from the transmitter. And the arm locks the lid shut unless the bird wearing the right transmitter is there. This, as you saw, can be quite frustrating for the birds who try to feed on hoppers that are not meant for them. So what is going on here? Conservationists are rationing the supplementary feed for each bird in an attempt to maintain them at optimal weight. So to feed them, but not too much. So why is this necessary? What lies behind this practice? The kakapo, as you might know, is the world's fattest parrot, and they are nocturnal and flightless. There are very few left in the world, at present just over 200, and they are subject to the very intensive conservation program that began in 1995. And their recovery went very, very slow. And because much was not known and the birds' breeding was very peculiar, as kakapos only breed in years when the rimu trees are fruiting, and that is almost every 4 years. And the kakapo females have to be of a certain weight to breed. So for a while, it seemed that supplementary feed was a solution. The kakapos were well fed and they seemed to have improved maternal condition, and they had increased breeding frequency. But another really peculiar problem appeared. The chicks produced were mostly males. With painstaking research in the early 2000s, it was demonstrated that too much food can influence the sex ratio of offspring, so producing a male bias in the population. The male bias is not good in a small population where the conservationists wanted many breeding females. So the females must be kept under a certain weight in order to produce female chicks. And here is where the smart hoppers come in. So because feeding is good only in certain quantities. So supplementary feeding is offered in a remote way without the humans being present and only while the weight of the kakapo is controlled. This technology is also making the life of conservationists easier. For the humans to chase the birds, to catch them and weigh them every time and feed them accordingly, this rough terrain of these New Zealand islands where the kakapos live would have been very labor intensive and also very stressful for the birds. So this sort of technology proves to be a solution to this particular problem. However, it is still unknown what does this do for the feeding habits of the birds in the long run, what the long-term effects of such technologies are. Okay, so I will try to wrap up. If one looks at the history of species conservation and practices, one can see a lot of technology, and especially in the case of critically endangered species. A common feature of these technologies of wildlife care is that they, or at least their underpinning principles, were originally developed for other purposes, for hunting or for military uses like telemetry, or in the medical or veterinary field. They were later adopted and adapted by the conservation community. And one idea in the current conservation debate is to start developing more customized technologies like this one that is meant for the kakapo and is a solution for a very particular problem. And most of these technologies are used and they are based on previous failures and learning processes. So they are constantly improved, and this obviously takes a toll on the animals. What these technologies have in common is that they make human intervention possible while also trying to erase or to hide the human in the relationship. It's a type of control that is withdrawal at the same time. So one of the biggest problems that was recognized by conservation was human handling of wildlife, which proved detrimental to the animals. So a thoughtful care of wildlife means letting the animals be as much as possible, separating the human out, but still intervening and controlling. And this fine balance, this conservation has always walked this very fine line between how much to intervene, how much to control the animals, and how much to let loose, how much autonomy. There's always they call it adaptive management. So there's always this sort of learning process going on. I will stop here and thank you very much for listening. And I hope this will generate a good discussion at the end.
Thank you very much indeed, Monica. We'll come back to you for questions after we've heard Emilie's paper. You can see there's rounds of applause going on screen now. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Emilie, can I ask you to, as I'm introducing you, oh, you've done it. Emilie's a JSPS postdoctoral fellow in the research faculty of media and communication at Hokkaido University, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Tourism Research at Wakayama University in Japan. Her current research explores the lives of captive red foxes in Japan's wildlife tourism industry through multi-species ethnography, with a particular focus on commodified encounters such as fox hugs. Emilie, sorry, my face just did a kind of ooh at that point. Emilie holds a PhD in tourism and psychology from Cardiff University in Wales, where she taught social psychology for several years, and she was until recently based in New Zealand. So Emilie, over to you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Erica, and good evening, everyone from Hokkaido. It was lovely to see those images of the kakapo because I did used to live in New Zealand for about 8 years, and I managed to meet one of those very rare and famous birds. So in this presentation, I would like to tell you about my ongoing research on captive Ezo red foxes in Japan's wildlife tourism industry, with a particular focus on feeding practices as seen through the lens of care. So captive animals are dependent on humans for their survival, and one of their most fundamental needs is to be fed. As such, feeding can be conceptualized as a form of practical interspecies care. In zoos and other wildlife tourist attractions, feeding practices are indicative of an establishment's broader philosophy regarding the care of its animals. Feeding can serve merely to keep animals alive, provide behavioral enrichment, or be commodified in interactive visitor experiences. Drawing on observational data from a multi-sited, multi-species ethnography of captive red foxes involved in Japanese wildlife tourism, I'm going to discuss 3 examples of feeding that illustrate how, as Tom van Duren puts it, care is a complex and compromised practice. Through this analysis, I identified 2 key dimensions characterizing careful feeding of red foxes: food surplus and fox mobility. Surplus food allows foxes to cache and limits conspecific aggression, while mobility provides them with a choice about how and when to participate in the feeding. Settings in which feeding encounters are commodified tend to lack one or both of these dimensions, often resulting in compromised animal welfare. I therefore argue that by foregrounding animal subjectivity, we can discover new modalities of care that are more sensitive to the needs of other species. So it should go without saying that red foxes are not commonly associated with zoos or other forms of captive wildlife tourism. In this respect, Japan is a somewhat unusual case. Here, they are considered to be culturally significant animals due to their close association with the Shinto deity Inari Okami, and statues of foxes can be found at many Shinto shrines like this one in Kyoto. The practice of displaying red foxes in public and private zoos really took off in the mid-1980s and centered on the Ezo red fox, or kitakitsune, a subspecies native to Hokkaido. In the preceding decade, the combination of a declining fur industry and the release of a popular documentary film about Ezo red foxes had set the scene for vulpine involvement in the captive wildlife tourism industry. It became common for public zoos in Hokkaido to raise and then keep abandoned fox cubs as part of their display of regional fauna. Also in Hokkaido, several small-scale tourist attractions were opened that showcased red and silver foxes that had been obtained from failing fur farms. And in Miyagi Prefecture, the now infamous Zawa Fox Village was established. Alongside the conventional visual encounters afforded by traditional public zoos, some of these tourist attractions also allowed visitors to hold and feed the foxes, often for an extra fee. These are examples of what Eric Cohen has referred to as close embodied encounters in wildlife tourism. The commodification of closeness with animals thus seems to be an increasingly important dimension of wildlife tourism in captive or semi-captive settings. Neil Carr and Donald Broom suggest that touching and interacting with wildlife can be interpreted as a form of social capital, with, quote, such experiences being perceived to be worth more than merely seeing an animal. It is close embodied encounters with captive red foxes involving feeding that I focus on here, in comparison to feeding practices in which visitors are not involved. I suggest that by inviting tourists to feed zoo animals, the illusion of a caring, mutually beneficial relationship is established. The foxes receive nourishment, tourists get to see the foxes up close and take really good photographs, and both parties are presumed to enjoy a fun, interactive interspecies encounter. It is this presumption that I wish to interrogate through my current research. So over the last 12 months, I have been conducting a multi-sited, multi-species ethnography of Ezo red foxes at 5 Japanese zoos. 2 of these are public zoos. Those are the 2 in orange on the map. And the remaining 3 are privately run wildlife tourist attractions. I've observed the foxes' interactions with staff, visitors, and one another through a series of short, focused field visits and drawn analytically on ethological knowledge of red fox behavior. I've approached my research as a social scientist interested in exploring the more than human social world. My ethnography is guided by a theorization of red foxes as individual sentient subjects who experience the world uniquely, possess intentional agency, and participate in complex forms of sociality. As such, I believe that they can be interpreted as legitimate social and ethnographic subjects. In treating the foxes in my research as ethnographic subjects, I have learnt to identify over 70 individuals in order to understand their unique personalities, experiences of captivity, and social relationships. Visual methods have allowed me to record and rewatch video footage of the foxes in order to help with their identification and interpretation of often complex behaviours. And these are just a few of the many faces in my study. I'm now going to present some ethnographic illustrations of feeding practices from 3 of my fieldwork sites, all 3 of which are the privately operated wildlife tourist attractions. Through these examples, I hope to explore how feeding can be conceptualized by visitors as positive acts of care, and also how vulpine experiences of feeding may challenge this interpretation. North Safari Sapporo is a popular petting zoo on the outskirts of Sapporo, where I live. In a section of the zoo called the Dangerous Forest, 3 Ezo-red foxes plus a silver and an Arctic fox can be found individually chained to small wooden shelters. This tethering of the foxes means that visitors can get extremely close to them without the need for a protective barrier. For 100 yen, which is about 60 pence in British currency, visitors can purchase a plastic ball containing 4 small dog biscuits from a nearby vending machine, seen here. The sound of the vending machine being activated rouses the foxes from their sleep. Foxes Canter and Goku often begin a synchronous pacing at this point. Visitors then typically decide which foxes they would like to feed, gently toss a biscuit their way, and sometimes film or photograph the encounter as they do so. When approached by a food-bearing visitor, the foxes often stop their pacing and stare at the biscuits in their hands. This intense vulpine gaze evokes a desire to be fed, a desire that appears to be fulfilled by the visitor's act of giving. In this sense, the feeding encounter resembles a practical act of care, of responding to the needs of the vulpine other. Certainly, the foxes appear to relish the food treats and never turn them down. However, the fox's intense focus on being fed can also be read as a product of boredom, because there is little else for them to do while being kept on a chain all day. Furthermore, there is potential, I believe, for these feeding encounters to cause frustration and even physical harm to the foxes. On the frequent occasions when a treat is thrown beyond their reach, the fox will typically try to get at it by pulling hard on their chain, thus putting repeated strain on their necks. Visitors will often help the foxes out by nudging the treat closer to them with a stick, or even picking it up with their hand and re-throwing it. These actions reflect the general tendency of visitors to respond kindly and carefully to the perceived needs of the foxes. Only on 2 occasions have I witnessed people taunting them by pretending to hold food in a closed fist, only to reveal with great amusement that there is nothing inside. Miyagizawa Fox Village houses a much larger number of foxes, with over 350 in total, comprising a mixture of reds, silvers, and other red fox colour morphs, and around 40 Arctic foxes. Although many of the animals here are caged, the facility has a spacious walk-through enclosure in a hilly woodland setting, which is home to around 140 free-ranging foxes. There is a large raised wooden platform located within the walk-through enclosure from which tourists can throw dog treats to the foxes. For 200 yen, or about £1.20, a bag of around 9 treats can be purchased. The encounter feels very different to that at North Safari Sapporo, since one looks down at the foxes from the platform, and because the foxes are not tethered in place. Groups of foxes loiter near the platform, and their desire to be fed is again palpable through their intense gaze. With only a small bag of treats and so many hungry-looking faces staring up at you, it can be difficult to decide whom to feed. Once this decision is made, a treat is dropped or thrown to the crowd below. Sadly, however, fights regularly break out between the foxes as they compete for the small number of snacks available. In this context, it is difficult to remain convinced that the feeding encounter constitutes an act of care. However, the discursive framing of red foxes in Japan as kawaii, or cute animals, can lead people to interpret conspecific violence as cute and comical, thus preventing them from recognizing harm occurring right before their eyes. I often saw visitors laughing at the foxes when they were fighting, as if it was just harmless squabbling. Other than these commodified feeding encounters, tourists at Miyagizawa Fox Village can occasionally witness the foxes being fed by staff. In the communal cages, which are used in particular for rearing young foxes, an employee dishes out a slurry containing meat scraps and dog kibble into troughs on the ground. In the main enclosure, a member of staff usually walks through scattering dry dog food on the ground from a large bag. In both cases, the pieces of food are so small that the foxes cannot afford to run off with them to eat in privacy for fear of there not being any left when they return. So they are forced to eat the food where it falls, creating a feeding frenzy in which the foxes jostle and attack one another. There also appears never to be any surplus food available for caching, a common practice in which foxes will bury food to eat later. Tourists who witness these acts of aggression at Miyagizawa Fox Village often conclude that red foxes are incapable of living peacefully in communal captive settings. It is frequently pointed out that foxes are naturally solitary creatures who only meet once a year to fight for mates and raise cubs. The question then becomes whether it is in fact possible to care adequately for these animals in captivity when kept in groups, or whether these efforts are futile in the face of the fox's innate antisocial behaviours. Kitakitsune Farm provides a fascinating comparison, given that the physical setup of its walk-through enclosure is almost identical to the one at Zawa Fox Village. Here, the enclosure is smaller, but so is the number of foxes, so the population density is comparable. Just under 50 Ezo red foxes live here, and there are no commodified feeding encounters available. However, tourists can witness the foxes being fed by a member of staff who walks through the enclosure scattering dry dog food on the lawn, feeding some foxes by hand and replenishing the food in 3 feeding stations. In stark contrast to the aggression at Zawa Fox Village, the foxes at Kitakitsune Farm graze peacefully side by side with only a little jostling and barely any fighting. A key difference is that here there appears always to be surplus food available. I've observed the feeding stations being restocked on several occasions and never seen the trays inside them run dry. This abundance of food removes the need for competition and also allows the foxes to cache. The knowledge that their food will not run out is embedded in the foxes from an early age. Raised mostly by the human staff, the kits spend the first months of their lives living indoors before moving to a transitional outdoor cage prior to their release into the main enclosure once they're big enough to fend for themselves. In this cage, there's also a seemingly never-ending food supply, and I witnessed no fighting between the young foxes over food. Excuse me. The practice of feeding at Kitakitsune Farm appears to exceed care as the provision of nourishment alone. The staff are able to recognize all of the foxes individually and to have a unique relationship with every one of them. Chogi, seen here, and Nana, for instance, seen here, have a particular preference for being fed by hand. So in the case of these foxes, the act of being fed may serve to reinforce the bond with the staff. This is a dimension of care that commodified encounters wherein animals are fed by strangers can never replicate. As these illustrations reveal, it should not be assumed that feeding practices in captive wildlife tourism are simply benign acts of care. The manifold ways in which feeding can take place results in a variety of experiential outcomes for both the foxes and their human visitors. In terms of attending better to the needs of the former, food surplus and fox mobility appear to be key dimensions of careful feeding. At Kitakitsune Farm, both dimensions are present, which allows the foxes to choose when and how to participate in the feeding, create food caches, and eat without the stress of conspecific competition. At the other sites, there appears to be no food surplus, which prevents the foxes from engaging in their natural behaviour of caching. At Miyagizawa Fox Village, the foxes' mobility grants them agency over how and when to participate in the feeding, but the lack of leftover food essentially means that they can only eat when they are being fed. and their ability to roam freely often results in aggressive interactions. At North Safari Sapporo, the fox's restricted mobility prevents the lack of food surplus from resulting in aggressive behaviour, because the foxes are physically unable to interact with one another or compete for the same pieces of food. However, their lack of mobility results in a significantly impoverished existence, in my opinion, leading to a rather unhealthy fixation on eating as one of the only activities available to them. It is clear then that there is a correlation between commodified feeding encounters at tourist attractions and what appear to be lower animal welfare standards. Given that this is the case, is it too generous to interpret these interactive visitor experiences as related to care at all? Are they not simply games to be played for the amusement of tourists, which can be bragged about later on social media? Without wishing to condone these commodified encounters, I believe that there is value in analysing tourists' experiences of them through the lens of care, in order to explore whether there is some redeemable aspect of their desire that could be redirected through more reciprocally beneficial practices. Visitors' retrieval of snacks that had gone awry at North Safari Sapporo indicates some recognition of the fox's frustration at not being able to reach the food and a desire to help them out. Similarly, some tourists at Nyagizawa Fox Village expressed sympathy for foxes near the feeding platform who appeared not to be getting their fair share of the treats. Others felt bad for not being able to satisfy the appetite of so many imploring little faces looking up at them. Indeed, this is something I experienced myself. In these brief moments, I see some evidence of tourists recognizing and attempting to respond appropriately to the vulpine other. Thus, in being affected by the other, perceiving a sort of ethical obligation to them, and responding through practical actions, we see various dimensions of care as conceptualized by Maria Puig de la Bella Casa as, quote, a vital affective state, an ethical obligation, and a practical labor. Still, these impulses towards caring for foxes are, in my view, compromised by a lack of species-specific knowledge, a failure to recognize poor animal welfare when confronted with it, and ultimately, an anthropocentric view of the tourist's enjoyment as of greater importance than the well-being of non-human animals in tourism. In this presentation, I have merely scraped the surface of these complex interspecies relationships and encounters. It is my hope that future research will deepen our understanding of these matters so that we can discover new modalities of care that are more sensitive to the needs of other species. Thank you for listening. Here are my references, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.